welcome to the ninth Chief Delegate meeting for the Eden 2 session. My name is Chuck McDonald. I am your chair for this meeting. I'm joined by Gracie Lau, Edgar Fernandez, Brock Pierce, and Michael O'Sullivan. And we're going to get right into it with our individual updates for this week. Myself, I've been trying to plan and partake in a vacation, and I'm on the road right now. But I joined a really exciting meeting yesterday with our Eden engagement meeting, Eden fractal, whatever you want to call it. The name is irrelevant and the deeds are more relevant. And we had a great meeting of 12 people showing up. We divided up into 2 teams of 6 people, had a little discussion about how each of us contributed to the EOS ecosystem, and then ranked each other from 1 to 6 based on the quality of their, or the consensus on the impact of their contributions. So we had a great time, and it's the start of weekly meetings. We're going to be doing this weekly, so it's an invitation to everybody in Eden, and we came to consensus that it's an open invitation to everybody outside of Eden also. So come join the weekly meetings and talk about the EOS ecosystem. And if you've contributed, explain your contributions, and you'll get rewarded. So we're rewarding people with NFTs and EOS, and a future sort of respect rating that will be implemented in the future. But we had a lot of fun, and we're team building. So it's a great thing. So again, the invitation is open for anybody in the whole EOS ecosystem, new users, anybody to come in and join these meetings and meet the people who are trying to help the ecosystem. So I'll go on to Gracie. Go ahead.
Okay, hello guys. My update will be very short. All this week, I'm just working on pushing for the Chinese Eden second child election, and I host a few space chats and online meetings with different crypto communities in China to share the ideas of Eden and what's new on EOS. And we got 25 new members this week, and there's more on the way on its inviting. And the election will be held on Sunday, this Sunday. And then I help with checking the accounts and the way to transfer the active permission, something like that. And then I think technically it's simple, and then but we need to really move fast on these things, because we don't need to get all the things done. That's what we ratifies on the bylaw, the update of the coding, but at least we need to update the time of the next election, right? Or it will be when the time on the bylaw comes, the election will not start. But we can talk about this under today's topic. That's all my update.
Michael?
Yep, I'm happy to do my update. So this is kind of a 2-week update, because obviously I was at Davos 2 weeks ago, and at Davos I spoke to quite a few politicians, European politicians, ministers of digital, about Eden and EOS and the things that we're doing. I also spoke to the Vice President of Ukraine, which was very cool. He's very excited about all the kind of DAO activity that's happening. I've also edited and posted the last Chief Delegate meeting videos online. They should be online as of yesterday. I used my funds to pay Dan and Felix to plan and launch the Eden Town Halls via Discord. We're doing them on Sundays on Discord and Thursdays on our Twitter space, all being well. I've created a formal template for Eden communications to be made public. I've wrote the Declaration of Eden Independence, and I've submitted it to fellow CDs to review. I prepared the Treasury weekly reports, which I'll go over shortly. And I've taken the community and delegate feedback on board and started the redrafting for the formal proposal for the Eden member services. And I had a conversation with Ray. He offered to provide us all of the IP and the original files for the Eden EOS org website and EOS community website. And he's looking to have a return of about 5 to 8% of his original investment. And he's looking for around 5,000 to 10,000 EOS for that. So that's a conversation we can have. And we started work on the formal proposal for the next set of CD bylaws. So I'll send those over to you. I'm trying to correlate some of the ideas that we've all been discussing and kind of forming them into some loose structure of bylaws, and then we can all just debate them and tidy it up. And I've started working on the new unified Eden web presence, trying to pull everything together. So when people Google us, when people want to find out more information, they can find out things about Eden and not be sparsely checking a million different websites. That's me.
Edgar?
Hi, yes. So we've been continuing to work on EDAS, on the Eden Delegate accounting system. We also hired 5 interns into Edania and are training them on Eden and Eden code, not only the fundamentals of Eden as a process, but also on the code itself. We have 2 of those interns going to be earmarked for working on EDAS, 2 are going to be working on a dashboard, but all of them will be trained in Eden, and hopefully they would make the voluntary decision as well to join. But we think it's important to also train new developers in this code, in the smart contract that governs it, and bringing more membership, right? So I think we're kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone in that sense, right? We're training, we're hiring, and we're increasing membership. So that's what we've been focused on this last week. We're happy to have them accept our offer and come on board. So hopefully I'll be providing more updates on the Eden interns as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Edgar. Brock?
Well, I was at Davos as well. We got to see each other briefly. Treasury update, no changes on my end since last week. Our council met. If we don't have other places to deploy, we'll be looking at the next round at Pomelo. At Helios, we ran a Twitter Spaces yesterday. We've also announced that we're organizing an 8-week-long virtual ideathon, kind of like a hackathon, but code doesn't necessarily need to be done. We're also working on a conference proposal to make sure that EOS is present at important events. And we're working with Jesse and the EOS Bees as originally, as part of my original, I guess, campaign commitment. And I'm sure there's other things, but that's our update.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brock. And we'll go into agenda item number 1 here, which would be the transfer of active keys and other assets to elected chief delegates. So at the last meeting, we discussed having a key transfer ceremony to celebrate, obviously, the peaceful transition of democratic power, as other democratic organizations do. And I just wanted to get discussion going on that. It's essential that that the elected delegates of Eden have the active control of the active keys of the Genesis.Eden account. And this, the chief delegates have come to consensus on this several times, formally also, and it's something that we really need to happen. So I'll open up the floor.
Just really briefly, yeah, I obviously completely agree with you, Chuck. As the democratically elected representatives, we need to have access to the infrastructure. Otherwise, we can't make any changes. We can't ratify or we can't implement the ratification changes we've made to the election timetable and to the redisbursement of funds. So to that end, I've put together a declaration of Eden and EOS independence or transfer of power. And I think what we'll do is, I've sent it to all the delegates, so you can all have a read of that and let me know if you want any changes. But I'm going to send that to the people who do control the keys privately, and hopefully they will provide us with the access we require. And we should have that hopefully sorted by next week, all being well. But I'll keep everyone informed of that. And I'll send an email out to everyone who has these access to these permissions, and I'll CC all the delegates in it. So we'll be in a chain, and we can monitor the progress like that.
Yeah, this is one of the things that we discussed in terms of there should be an inauguration type of event, a key signing ceremony, a declaration, whatever it is. You know, again, these are the many things that this group of chief delegates has been thinking through. How do we, you know, transition power? And we're trying to target June 15th, you know, to honor Magna Carta Day. We'll see if we can get there or not. The Magna Carta being, from my perspective, the birthing of decentralization.
Yeah, I'd also like to reiterate that coincides. Well, that's next Wednesday, and we're having our Eden fractal meeting that day. So there should be a whole bunch of people online, and we could have a nice big party. So everybody's obviously invited to that. Specifically the active key holders as they are right now. Yeah, is there any more discussion on that? And we can move on to
just to check, really, does everyone agree with the approach of the declaration and the request, the formal request, to basically politely ask them to hand everything over to us, unless anyone has a better approach?
No, I think that's the right next move. I mean, we've publicly on these calls asked for that. We've given reasons why we need it. It's necessary to implement the bylaws changes that we all ratified. So this is just a logical next step. I think it's a formal document. We should think about what the following step would be, right? If need be, right? If we want to do this by next week, we all review the draft that Michael circulated, we agree upon it, we publish it. That doesn't necessarily mean that we receive a response. And we should start thinking about, you know, what we do in that scenario as well.
So what you're suggesting, Edgar, is a contingency plan for if we can't get hold of the Genesis keys in time for the next election. I would guess. Correct.
I think we begin to think about that because really, what we've already asked for them, right? Now we're formalizing it, right? The initial request that was done, you know, informally or verbally, hasn't been fulfilled, right? So I hope and I certainly encourage that after a formal request that they are fulfilled, but I don't necessarily, you know, it's not necessarily a guarantee. And if that's the case, then we're going to have to not only delay that transfer, but also think of the implications to the changes that are needed to fulfill the ratification of the new bylaws. That's my point. I don't think we need to decide what that contingency plan is now, but certainly think about that, because I think, you know, we can't simply decree things into existence and they happen. So we have to think about how we can be amicable and political, and well, not political, but, you know, diplomatic about it. But I think this is the right step is my overlying message. Yeah,
I guess for everybody's information, the ultimate contingency plan would be somebody crafts an MSIG and asks the owners of the account to change the active permissions, right? That would be the ultimate fallback.
Could we do that in parallel to the official documentation? I mean, we're going to do this declaration that Michael's circulating. We public that, and then we also issue an MSIG.
Well, it's probably something that should be in a permanent fallback position, right? Like it should be there in code, even like if this cannot happen, if there is no transfer of keys, then then we have to appeal to the owners of the account, right? And it's not like an MSIG is a difficult thing to craft, but it's just that I guess we all agree that that's the ultimate fallback. There is no other recourse if if the keys are not forthcoming, right?
Well, I guess there is another recourse in the sense that, I mean, even if we create a new multi-sig, right, we would still have to ask their permission to transfer the funds and everything else. So we would still be at their behest. So the ultimate fallback would be, and this is something we should definitely not do, but this would be the ultimate fallback, would be to de-ratify the bylaws and host the election when the smart contract allows us to. That's the unfortunate, terrible worst case scenario. And I think we should work to develop a better worst case scenario.
Well, no, I think the ultimate fallback is that there's an owner of the Genesis.Eden account and there's active, right? And the owner is the block producers, right? And this isn't like another scenario where we're appealing to the block producers to change something, or emergency situation. This is like, you're the owners of this account. This is what you were, this is the agreed upon fallback. Like if the democratic method falls through, you guys are the owners, and if we come to a consensus, you guys should be able to perform your duties as owners, right? But again, this is worst case Ontario. And we don't need to even, I don't think we need to talk about this. So we could probably move on to the next subject if nobody else has anything to say. Anybody? No. Okay. So item 5, we have scheduling of new bylaws discussion and drafting. So one thing that the previous chief delegates did exceptionally well was talk about a bunch of ideas for bylaws changes, and then talk about their implications, talk about implementation, and then draft some forms for feedback with the community and all that. Time is rather tight for us. We have really less than 2 weeks to get this in gear. So we're going to need to schedule a community meeting of some sort, in my opinion, a community meeting where we can get interested Eden members to come in and talk about what the low-hanging fruit might be in terms of new bylaws. So we'll just open that up. If anybody has any ideas on when that meeting can happen, or if we should have a meeting, or if chief delegates should have another say meeting halfway through this week or something, go ahead.
Yeah, I think because we had we missed a meeting, what I think we should do, just to make sure that we've dedicated ample time to this, is to schedule a special meeting just to focus on bylaws and spend an hour just doing that. But I think it's good to get the rest of the ideas out.
So we can look at scheduling that meeting then. Go ahead, Michael.
I was just going to say, yeah, I definitely agree. We should have a dedicated meeting for that. We should do it, as soon as possible. I'm starting to collate some of the ideas that we've all come up with over the last few weeks and put them into a document. But my only concern is, obviously, we can't technically implement the first changes of the bylaw. So making a whole load of new changes could be a waste of time if we can't actually implement them, assuming that we can't. So just something to bear in mind. So hopefully that's sorted. It just goes to demonstrate the actual depth of this problem, because we can't integrate the last two delegates' wishes, and then we can't leave new wishes for the next ones. So it's a real problem. So it's like we can't really do anything until that's solved.
Yeah, some thoughts on that. I agree, Michael. We can't create new bylaw changes that create new changes to the code until we've actually implemented the last ones that we just ratified. However, we can propose, because at the end of the day, it's not going to be until the next chief delegates that actually choose to ratify those changes and then implement. And they might choose to say, well, the first bylaws were not implemented yet, and therefore we're not going to ratify the changes of the last chief delegates until that's done. I shy away from not proposing any changes because we haven't been able, for the reasons that we know, haven't been able to implement the last changes. But I'm up for scheduling another meeting if that's needed to kind of get that first draft in. And I've got a few points of things that we should address, but I'll leave that for later, Chuck.
Okay, so well, we can schedule that outside of this meeting in our Telegram channel. So we'll work on that. We can move along to the next agenda item, which would be I wanted to speak about the Eden engagement meeting that we had yesterday. I've said what I had to say basically in my 2-minute update. But one, I don't know, we've been talking about Eden member services and the need for engagement, the need for a budget for engagement. We've been talking about the need for tech, a technical sphere. And we're going to also have to need to talk about an ongoing budget for technical. But is this something that we're willing to talk about without, a formal bylaw change? Like it is when we do have active permissions, would we be willing to allocate a budget to these priorities, such as running the next election, such as Eden engagement, such as technical? Because it's with we've been talking about it. I think we've reached consensus a few times on this, but it's with ongoing expenses that are for the good of Eden. It's unreasonable, and I would say it's counter to the ideals of Eden. It's unreasonable to have an ongoing expense that you're expecting delegates to pay for out of their awarded funds, right? So what I would like to see, this is the long way around of saying, we've got a good thing going with these weekly meetings, and we're going to push it. We're going to go every Wednesday, and we're just going to have these weekly meetings the way that Fractally is having their weekly meetings. They've got a great population going of weekly contributors, and we can be going along the same way, but we would like to distribute rewards to people who participate. So I've committed to the next meeting to rewarding in the form of locked EOS in NFTs. So we're going to be awarding the rankings, the respective rankings based on the consensus in each meeting. And they'll be receiving Eden style NFTs that have EOS embedded in them, like locked in them. So the only way that you can liquefy that EOS would be to burn the NFT. And this is another idea that has come up, is joining the Yield Plus program. Eden has 200,000 some odd EOS in its treasury or in the community right now. And that's the threshold to participate in the supposed threshold to participate in Yield Plus, which would be encouraging people to lock up EOS as the chain increases its total value locked. All the arguments, I think the consensus of Yield Plus is that token price should be going up as TVL increases. And I think Eden can do a great thing with paying workers and or maybe not paying workers, but paying, rewarding people for their engagement in the form of backed NFTs. And then we should investigate a DeFi process in Eden, whereby they might be able to stake those NFTs for yield. And it's something that we should investigate. We need to have a working group basically within Eden to talk about how to implement Yield Plus, or whether we want to, right? But the membership seems to be behind that idea. And I think it's a good thing that Eden members could generate some yield on the work that they've done, right? And rather than distributing like 5, 10, 20 EOS here and there, if we distributed things that could encourage the lockup and then staking, it could be a really good example of NFT DeFi for EOS. So anyway, that was my idea regarding the Eden engagement meetings particularly. But if anybody has any comments on when we do have the keys, whether we should be distributing funding to the critical areas right now, which would be running the election, maybe the technical updates, and also the Eden engagement.
Yeah, I have a short answer for that, and that's yes.
Fantastic. Moving right along. You want to elaborate, Michael?
Yeah, of course. So obviously, if we do get access, then we need the funds to run the elections. We need the funds to make the code changes, to ratify or to implement the ratification of the bylaws. So in my Eden member service, it was originally intended to kick in from this month. So I was hoping we would have access to the funds for the last month, which we would be able to use to set up the Eden member services and to leave those in a position where they were created for the next delegates, and they could decide if they wanted to keep them or not. Through the ratification of the bylaws. So I stand by, I think we need it, especially if we were to, for example, buy the websites from Ray, just as an example, where we're going to get 5,000 EOS from. The only place we could potentially get it from would be the Treasury. I'm not saying that we should buy, I'm just saying that, if that decision is made, we need funds from somewhere. So if we want to expand things, if we want to back your NFT projects, if we want to discuss having our technical sphere to progress Eden, which I think is a no-brainer, then we need access to those funds. But we need to do so in a democratic and transparent way, in a way that's backed fully by the community.
Would anybody else have anything to say on that?
I want to mention something that first I totally agree that we need some funds for the things we need to be done by some teams or ourselves. But there's one thing: if we don't change the code, the Treasury cannot directly send to somebody. That's in the code. So that's back to the problem we talked before. We need somebody or a tech team to help us to update the code first. And before this, we need the active permission first.
Edgar and Brock, do you have any thoughts on if we gain access to the Treasury, should we use any of the funds prior to the end of our term?
Yeah, I think we should have a budget. And the question is, how is that budget funded? Should it come from Treasury? Probably, right? The organization itself should have a budget that is put together by the delegates, right? Approved by the delegates, but it should probably be funded independently than the delegates, and their resources to deploy on behalf of the ecosystem based upon how they got elected. that's another thing that we should be doing in the immediate term. If we don't have that budget, am I willing to contribute some of my resources to funding, call it operations of Eden? Yes. But do I think that's the right, is that how things should function? Probably not. I think that there should be a budget and it should be funded independently from the delegate, call it treasury funds.
I've been kind of beating around the bush here, but it's Edgar committed to the technical updates, but since then the value of EOS has been cut in half, right? And he also since the bylaws were ratified, he doesn't have the 5x that the chief delegate or the head chief delegate would have had, right? So it's pretty critical that we address that. We need to fund these updates, and I'm just wondering if that's a pain point right now. The budget has significantly changed just because of the state of the the token value.
Yeah, 100%. We committed to scoping the changes, and I think, as Gracie has brought up, it's not so much the level of effort in making the changes, but the ability to do so, and we haven't had that yet. So I think if we do get that ability to make the changes, we can do that. The token price halving, the head chief delegates funding decreasing does impact the ability to do that, right? I think that's another question, right? We're debating here whether we grab some funds from the treasury and we put them into a collective fund that's like technical updates or something, right? And we all have a multi-sig and we all kind of approve that, and it doesn't come from any of the chief delegates approved allocation. So that's one way to do it, right? And that's kind of, I think, where we're getting that consensus. We need to get into the cookie jar, grab those funds from the treasury. That's basically our funds that's just not spread out, right? And future funds. And we're going to earmark these for technical updates. And then later on, the chief delegates are going to decide who those funds go to actually implement this, right? We have to hire someone to do it, right? Just because we have the funding doesn't mean it gets done. And what happens if we need more funds? Well, then we have to go back to treasury, or we go back to the NI. The other way to approach this is that in the election process, people run with the platform that what they're going to do with their funds is implement technical changes. I'm not saying that's the right way to do it. I'm not saying it's the wrong way to do it. I'm just saying it's another approach, right? Where everybody says, oh, I know that the Eden treasury or the Eden organization, or what we want to call ourselves, needs technical updates. I'm going to run with saying, if I'm elected, I will use all my funds to make these technical updates, right? I mean, that's just another approach. And
by the way, the one thing about that approach is it mitigates one of the risks of spending, borrowing from the future, and it definitely will encourage people to vote for those that are going to build.
Right, and then the onus is on that person knowing how much they're going to get, whether they want to implement those changes, knowing what the previous bylaws are already, because it should be public, because it comes from the past one. And then, they run the risk, right? And then they decide whether they want to hedge. I got, some feedback, negative feedback, that I was talking about hedging out EOS. No, I'm talking about hedging your budget. Are you paying people in purchasing power, right? We've seen projects exit EOS because they didn't hedge their Pomelo grant, they didn't hedge their grant, they didn't hedge their inflation rewards, and so therefore they can't pay their devs that was denominated in whatever unit of account. But yes, so in that point, we're not grabbing a treasury and putting it to a member service. each one is just running on that election, which kind of comes into the same big question, right? Should people be running on their leadership skills? Should people be running on their ability to execute a certain project? Should people be running on their ability to just grab those funds and execute, a pre-existing requirement? I'm not going to suggest one way or the other, but those are definitely different approaches. It seems that this delegation wants to take the approach of earmarking funds, having those active keys to the owner keys to the treasury account, and moving them into each specific circle. That's what we reviewed with Michael, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, broadly right.
The problem there is that we're not necessarily assigning anyone to execute on that. So we're securing funding, but at the same time, we're not. Now we have to go into a procurement process, right? Or, for example, I nominated Adenia at the beginning to look into and scope the work for these technical changes, right? Nominate doesn't mean that it's necessarily selected. It is also an open invitation for others to want to do so. But then the onus is on us to actually hire these people, right? And pay them. So just because we secure funding doesn't necessarily mean kind of, again, code changes by decree, code changes by earmarking funds, doesn't necessarily mean it happens. You still need to find that person and execute it.
There is the other option too, is rather than tapping into Eden Treasury, we could scope out what we think Eden needs in terms of, call it a major technical overhaul, development, whatever, and we could submit a proposal to the ENF. There are other ways that this could be, as a one-time, basically development plan, right?
Yeah, I think that's for like big change, like you mentioned, Brock, like an overhaul. I feel like you need continuity on that team. You need sort of like that long-term funding, someone that knows that they have this contract that's going to, allocating time, hiring people, training them, keeping them on board, keeping them as, Eden dev team kind of thing is better done on a long-term sustainable basis more than a one-off basis. And I'm just, thinking through this out loud right now and not necessarily getting to the right way or not, but I do think that having secured funding and a secure team identified, hired to do small support and changes similar to what Clarion was doing previously, makes the most amount of sense, because a lot of the changes, as Gracie's mentioned too, is they're not huge overhauls of it. There might be in the future, but for right now, it's kind of tweaks and to figure out what the best way to have that be sustainable going forward.
And that's another conversation that this, term of delegates, also should be having that conversation around, should Eden be built on fractally? A lot of those conversations were the prior group and less so ourselves, but that's another conversation should, potentially be revisited, since they in theory have funding as they continue to build out platform, and whether we stay independent or operate really in a more of a SaaS type model on top of their infrastructure. We haven't, it's another thing that we can always revisit.
Yeah, once we know what that what that infrastructure would look like, it's hard right now to talk to make plans in that direction. Yeah.
Well, I think we continue with what we've done. I think there's a continuity to Michael's proposal for member services, to earmarking these circles. I think we've gotten to consensus around that. I'm not trying to break that. I'm just trying to look at what the other alternative would be. And as I think through those, I think we're on the right track. I think funding member services, having circles, having funds behind them, trying to have that continuity as we transfer into new chief delegates and having their, whether contract or involvement or funding of that circle be the continuity from the other chief delegates, I think that's the right approach. So I would support that. I mean, once we get those keys, earmarking funds for those specific circles, and then having people nominate themselves or nominate others to lead each circle.
Yeah, I think just testing the air, like there was broad support, or there has been ongoing broad support from the Eden community, from things that I've seen, for the instantiation of these circles, the member services plan. That well, we had a motion on it. We voted to move on it, and I think it makes a lot of sense to have persistent teams that are going to, like a civil service in a government. And I think there was broad consensus that that's a good direction for Eden to be moving in. And obviously one of the points of hesitancy for us is nominating who's going to be running those circles, right? Like we've got, as elected leaders, we've got the role of maybe setting some things up, but then maybe we do need a very transparent procurement process to identify the leaders of those circles and hire them. So that's something that we need to talk about. But I don't think we could talk too long about it, because these things need to happen. But one of the things that we discussed was that the leaders of these circles would be accountable to each term of delegates, right? Chief delegates. So when the new chief delegates come in, they could right away clean house and appoint new leaders of these circles, right? So I think the accountability and for job performance, we built right into these circles that you will be replaced if you're not performing, right? So I don't think there's a great conflict of interest there or anything. We need to appoint, we need to build these circles, appoint teams, appoint leaders for the circles. We need to invite applications, have a transparent process to appoint people to these circles, but then we need to empower them. And I think that's something that we can move on quickly, right? But again, all of this depends on having control over that account. So Gracie, you were also mentioning, can you elaborate on, is there code that would need to change to just free up the funds in that account? Is that what you were saying?
Kind of confused of the question.
You were saying that right now we would need to change the code to transfer EOS to an individual.
Yes. Now the code is don't allow people, even the people have the active permission to change the EOS from the treasury to other people. It's not allowed to do that. But maybe can change to Eden members. I didn't test that yet because we just do the test about changing out of the system.
Once we built some circles, for example, each circle would conceivably have their own account, and you would have somebody in charge of that account, or on an MSIG for that account, and we could transfer funding to those new accounts. And it's also, it's another subject, but it's the same subject, but the top level domain .eden is also an asset that I believe this organization needs to have control over. And it's, again, it's not something that we've specifically asked for, but we need to have the owner and active keys to that account. Does everybody agree on that, or is there any dispute over that? Because that was one of those assets that was purchased and developed at the very beginning of Eden for the specific purpose of building Eden, right? And the individuals who did that were paid by the network for that work. And it wasn't just code that they were paid for, it was the action of building Eden, if I'm correct. But again, I asked about it, and there was no formal agreement between the ENF and the Clarion team. But that was my impression, that the payment was there to build Eden, right? And that meant the social assets, the web assets, the top level domain .eden, all those kinds of things. And I think there's consensus within our community, but I need to reiterate that that's a very significant thing that we need to be talking about. And I really invite those Eden members who have control of that to think about this scenario. We're in a very tough spot here, right? Anyway, I think we should move along unless anybody else has anything else to say about that. So we're going to progress on, I think, number 7 here, the technical sphere funding and progress on bylaws implementation. I think we've already discussed that, unless anything else needs to be said. Now, item 8, an election July 9th planning team. Is there anything, should we be putting together an election circle, for example, or should a planning team? And I know that we sort of touched on this, but does anybody have anything to say about that?
Yeah, so I think we should form a circle as soon as possible, an election circle, and we should invite the former Clarion and Fractally teams or whomever worked on Eden to assist us in this circle. And this should be an election circle that ensures the continuity of the Eden election process and all that entails. So changing the websites, getting control of the keys, being able to update the code, all of those things we should have the expertise in that circle to be able to do so. And we should move quite quickly in order to hit the deadline. Because if we don't really have the code changed in the next 2 weeks, I would suggest maybe 3, then we're probably out of time to realistically change it by the election date. And if we change the election date, then it's gonna mess up everything. So I think we should work towards that, see if we can achieve it in that amount of time we have. And yeah, give it a go, basically. I think we can do it. I think we should try as well.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I think that's one of the most important, if not the most important circle, I think, is whether we want to call it the election circle or the transition circle. Somewhat of, I think they're related. That transition of power and exactly what you're talking about. I think that's the number one kind of first member service that we should bring in, and hopefully we have the others that ran the past elections so well help us, assist us at least in this transition period, and hopefully translating that knowledge so we can continue to do that and do the same for the next team that comes after us. So I completely support that, and I agree we should do that immediately. One thing that I'm not too sure, but whose Zoom kind of account we used for the large election last time and for bringing the community together. If that's not available, I would make our room available for that as well. So at least helping with some of the tooling, but I think that's, kind of blocking and tackling of running this election is that where we're going to meet, what the link is, obviously communicating that to the community. I agree, website updates is clear of signing up for the next election, the logistics of where it's going to be held, what Zoom link is going to be used, et cetera, and whether we need funding or not to compensate for that, or any resources we might need to fund that circle.
I think we should be coming from the perspective that we do need resources to fund our elections. Like, in RL, we don't run elections for free. It just doesn't happen, right? That there's manpower that goes into this process, and building an organization that depends on volunteerism is not a blueprint for success. So we need to build these expenses into our circles, and that's my opinion. Does anybody else have anything to say on building a team for this?
Outside of the money element, I think we need to be doing like PR as delegates, chief delegates. I think we need to be on every single chat in the next few weeks, just really reminding the community that the election is coming up, reminding them that it's vital that they sign up and it's vital that they're part of the Eden community and they remain part of it if we want to have a mandate for the next delegates, and also to solidify the legitimacy of Eden. We have to have our members partake in the election. If we have 50 people at the election, whatever, that's not really enough. We need to be clearing 100, 200 people, as we need to show progress and not degress, if you like. So I just think we should all go on a bit of a PR charm offensive and just remind the community about the election.
Any other comments on that subject? Well, we can move right along to the next item, which is conclusion of this meeting. No. Does anybody have anything else that they'd like to bring up?
I've been just quickly, I know we're over time, and but I did want to bring this up. It's sort of thinking about the existential risks to Eden. Obviously apathy and kind of a fractured communication, some moving to other projects, key members moving to other projects and then taking some delegates with them. I think that's, existential, right? We just have apathy and lack of interest and lack of participation in the election is one risk. The other one is funding, right? We've discussed this several times. We talk about the independence of Eden and the separation and some of the checks and balances that this can bring to blockchain governance generally. But what happens in the situation where, for example, the board of directors of the ENF or the president of the ENF doesn't like the CDs that were elected, right? And wants to wait to the next election. So we're not going to engage, we're not going to transfer, we're not going to fund. And we're just going to wait to the next election and we have people that we like, and then we'll make them successful, right? Because, I think as we've learned from more than half of our term now is, there are certain inputs, external dependencies that we still have that may or may not drive the success of what we as chief delegates are trying to do. And I'm not saying that's the case. I'm bringing it nonetheless as a risk, right? Of, what if we don't have the support of the ENF, not for us, but for future delegates, or us for that matter. But that's just kind of a way to undermine this process, and is somewhat of a real risk, right? What happens if you do not have the support of your chief funding source, or you don't have the support of the block producers generally, right? Chuck, you talked about that as a contingency plan going, and having who owns the account, right? Kind of in the worst case scenario kind of thing. Well, if you don't have the support of the block producers, they could just ignore that request. We're kind of stuck in a situation where it looks like Eden failed, but really it was sabotaged, if you will. How do we prevent that? And as we go into thinking about bylaws into that, how does that, and I think it's very much connected to the first point, the apathy, because if I think that this organization is not going to have funding, that it doesn't have a legitimate mandate, that doesn't have the backing of either the block producers or the ENF and its chief financer, right, or funding source, then maybe I become more apathetic. I'm like, well, it doesn't seem like they even have funds. They don't even have backing, and with, large figureheads not being involved. Thankfully, Brock is very much involved, but that could be a risk too. It's sort of a negative flywheel, right, or a terrible spiraling, a death spiral, where that's self-inflicted, right? It's sort of like, well, they don't have funding, they don't have the backing, so therefore I'm not going to participate in the election because it's not really it's not sustainable, right? And it's not going to happen. So the election goes badly. So the ENF said it failed. I'm not going to fund this process anymore. This experiment now failed. Let's wait to the next chief delegates until someone that's more, of our liking, or let's just fork it and start anew, right? Or move on to fractally or something else. So I did want to bring that up because, if us here agree that is an existential risk, both apathy and I don't want to call it just that risk, right? That risk of, look, we don't have to necessarily help them out. So let's just see what happens if we don't help out, and wait until we have people that we do want to help out.
Well,
then that kind of takes away the election.
If you even want the organization to exist at all.
Correct, right? At
Most people don't want, most people in power don't want democratic elections.
100%. And they will support until they don't support, right? So that's my point. And I'm not talking about the current ENF. I'm not talking about the current chief delegates. I'm talking about this, if this is truly an institution that wants to, live on for years to come and decades to come and be successful, we might have that situation where the ENF has no interest in having Eden oversight, or the block producers have no interest or have no interest in funding it, right? And to Brock, to your point, that's historically how it happens. But it will be painted as a failure, as this experiment being failing, when in reality it was sabotaged. And I want to think about that and think what controls can be in place. I don't have the right answer, but I did want to. I know we don't have a lot of time here, but yeah, I did want to fit it in this meeting because it is something that we want to start thinking about, especially when we start to propose bylaws, and a context we have as we find these obstacles and these problems that we as chief delegates already find that could be exacerbated by, more, I want to say tyrant leaders, but or whatever, right? Just misaligned incentives, I will call it, between different organizations and parties.
If I can, the mission statement that evolved out of the last term was to provide value to the EOS ecosystem, right? And the EOS ecosystem valued Eden because it had the promise of a democratic, like a technological kernel that was going to grow into something else, right? And grow into a democratic tool. And if we think about the reason for being of Eden right now, our mission statement is to essentially respect EOS, because EOS is our prime benefactor, right? So if you look at the owner permissions of our treasury account, genesis.eden, it's the network, right? But what if there was another benefactor? Like what if there was a global democratic organization, like an endowment fund for democracy that we appealed to, and we just said, look, like we're a democratic fledgling organization. Give us $1 million, please, and let's get started really, really improving democracy, right? And that would change our mission statement, wouldn't it? If we had different benefactors. Now, if you step back a little bit and just say, look at the new EOS.io coalition. We've got these other networks who are running on the same code. We're all one family, and they have a use for a democratic organization. Also, they have an interest in fostering democracy. I've used the term something to counterbalance the cold logic of DPoS as it is right now, right? People are arguing that DPoS is captured or is dominated or whatever, and almost everybody is open to the possibility of adding a little bit of human accountability and credibility to DPoS. And like, for example, what if we did start offering MSIG as a service to other DPoS chains? And what if they didn't pay us in EOS? Then we would have to have an account for these other EOS.io currencies. It would all be, controlled maybe out of the chief delegates and the delegates. But like, we have to start thinking about what happens when we do have other credible funding sources for this organization. Does it change our mission? Does it change our outlook on things? If tomorrow we were funded, for example, by the United Nations, democracy, let's improve democracy. It was just a pilot, and it was like, these guys are a credible DAO, and they have the support of their network, and let's give $1 million. That would overnight, that would change our mission, because we have to show some deference to our funding sources, right? And everybody in Eden is interested in having independence for this organization, and us offering something of value to the world. But I'm just wondering, like you were saying, worst case scenario, and we have to think about these possibilities that we could come up against great opposition in the network itself, in the EOS network, but we could also come up against great openness in the outside world. So what happens when that stuff happens? Or is it something that we should be pursuing? Like, should we be applying for grants from international organizations, for example? There are a lot of resources out there, and if we wanted to work on improving democracy and democratic tools, and like, this all goes back to us packaging and marketing and sharing our technology, right? Sharing Eden as a DApp, right? The funding could exist for that, right? Anyway, we're at the end of the meeting, at the brainstorming session, and yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, I'd love, which we don't need to do now, but I'd love to have a conversation around DAO infrastructure and where you think, we stack up to, what else is in the ecosystem, right? There's a lot of DAO governance infrastructure, venture backing, SaaS platforms emerging, highly competitive space that's moving quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think I didn't want to bring this up for debate right now, but I think it's important that we go through it. Just last final thought from my end is, we are Eden on EOS right now, and our mission is to bring value to EOS network. You're right. If we had a different benefactor, that mission would change. That's not the case right now, and it's not to say that we can't find other benefactors right now. What I'm saying is more, what if what Eden is trying to bring value on EOS doesn't necessarily align with what its network benefactors or it's the foundation thinks is bringing value to EOS, right? In that scenario, right? Not that Eden can't find funding somewhere else, but in the funding for the mission that we have right now, if there is a disagreement on how to achieve that mission, whether that's cut from under us, we're then, if we go to another benefactor, we're not going to come back to EOS. And now it changes. Now it's value into whatever that new benefactor is asking for. So it again kind of begs the question again: how do we become self-funded? How do we become independently funded? Right? I know we need activation energy, and that's where we are, but that's the only way that I see that happening, where we can, in a democratic, using our process, assign a funding to people that have a certain mission that they want to accomplish, and therefore reach that goal, which is bringing value to EOS at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, I've got to drop. I'm late to my next thing. I had a 15-minute buffer in here, but yes. I mean, that it is an important question. If we don't think that this organization is supported by the network, I mean, what's the point, right? I mean, I did this for the purposes of supporting EOS. It is conceivable that we could have a conversation with Telos and say, is Telos interested in a democratically elected infrastructure is, we could go have a conversation with another EOS IO sort of chain if we didn't have support. I'm not, I wouldn't be so interested as a chief delegate of trying to move this infrastructure to, Tezos, for example. Those are options conceivably, finding a different benefactor. But yeah, these are the important conversations. And do we have an organization that is supported and will be around in a year? And if we don't think so, what do we do? I mean, if I didn't think that the organization has got longevity or purpose long term, I wouldn't tell someone to go spend, to do what we're doing right now and do all of this work for something that's not going anywhere. So it is a legitimate concern. I mean, if I'm running for, the next election, I want to know that there's going to be resources, or what's the point of investing in an organization that is going to run out of resources in 9 months or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. And it leads to that kind of vicious cycle, the death spiral in a way. Not that I think we're in it, but I think we need to start thinking of the controls to prevent it. With that, I think we all have to jump off. We can maybe take this offline. I'd love to hear more thoughts from Michael and Gracie on this, and Brock as well.
Yeah, Michael and I communicate somewhat, often, but I'm happy to talk. I'm happy to be in regular and constant communication. So yeah, if you want to ping me anytime. All right, thank you.
See you later, guys.
Signing out.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.